Welcome to Cookies Maths and Science Hub. Today, we'll be going through how to make the perfect high school or college lab report. A standard lab report has many different sections, each of which we'll work through in more detail. These sections are an introduction, an aim, a hypothesis, materials and methods section, results, a discussion, and finally, a conclusion. To assist with this video and highlighting what is important to include in these sections, we're going to use an example lab report that we can discuss throughout and reference how we would use what we discuss in a proper lab report. For this example, we're doing the simple practical of how does the amount of water affect plant growth over a set period of time. We'll use this to refer to a proper example throughout this video. Looking at the introduction for our lab report, this is a really good way to frame what you're going to talk about in your lab report and the content you are exploring, hence the term introduction. In your introduction, you should aim to include 3 paragraphs of information. Your first paragraph should start quite broad and discuss the topic you're investigating. This would discuss the terms you're exploring and the different science involved within the experiment. Your second paragraph should discuss previous research into that topic, discussing how different research has contributed to our current understanding and what other experiments have been conducted that are similar to yours. Your final paragraph should discuss how you will conduct your experiment. This should talk about how you're going to make your experiment reliable and accurate and what you're going to do to ensure that your results are something that are valid. Looking at our example of how does the amount of water affect plant growth over a set period of time, for our first paragraph, you should talk about the importance of understanding plant growth and the agricultural significance of knowing how much water is helpful when growing plants. Your second paragraph could reference other experiments discussing water usage for growing plants. It's always good to include actual references in these first 2 paragraphs. And your final paragraph would discuss how you would make this experiment reliable and accurate, highlighting those control variables and how you intend to maintain control over them to make your experiment fair. Your aim should be the first thing you complete, as this is what you're setting out to find out through your lab report and experimentation. Your aim should be brief but to the point. It should state how you're looking to work out how the independent variable, that is the thing you're changing in your experiment, affects the dependent variable, that is the thing you are measuring. For our example, the aim of this experiment is to determine how the amount of water, that is our independent variable, will affect the growth of the plant, that is our dependent variable. As you can see, it is short and sharp and to the point, but clearly and concisely states what the aim of our experiment is. Your hypothesis should be done in union with your aim, as this is your prediction of what you think will happen in your experiment. Your hypothesis should start off with a basic prediction. Effectively, how do you think the independent variable will affect the dependent variable? So that is, how do you think what you're changing will affect your measurements in this experiment? To really develop your hypothesis, you should then explain your reasoning. So why do you think this? It's always good to give specific examples of how this effect might look on your data. So, why do you think this? What evidence do you have to back up your suggestion? Is it from class work that you've studied? Or is it something that you've read online somewhere or research that's already been done into this experiment? Let's look at our example in particular now. In this experiment, it is predicted that more water will help the plant grow, but only till a certain point until it becomes too much and is actually detrimental to the plant. This aligns with studies into how the watering of plants and how water can be both helpful and detrimental to a plant's growth. Now, I've just said someone 2023 there, but you'd want to include an actual reference for your experiment. The last little bit I'll say with your hypothesis is for those who are looking to extend themselves even further, it is here where you can predict the correlation of your data. This is whether it has a strong positive correlation or maybe a weak negative correlation. Effectively, correlation is all about if it goes, so for our example, if increasing the amount of water also increases the plant's growth, we would have a positive correlation. Again, that's something you can do to extend yourself and is more at the high levels of thinking. So don't stress too much about that right now. But if you did want to push yourself, it's something you should look into. Your materials and method are always a good section to get nice, easy marks in, when you're getting marked on a lab report, that is, as they can be quite easy to construct neat and series lists of materials and your method for how you completed the experiment. Your materials should be listed clearly and with accurate measurements included within your materials. This includes proper amounts used of each material you've got, proper equipment names, etc. Your method, on the other hand, should be directed steps that can be easily followed. You should specify when equipment must be used. You should have it as a numbered list without personal pronouns, meaning no we, then, I did, etc. And it should assist in maintaining control over the experiment, making sure those control variables are kept the same throughout. Look at our example now. Now, I've not provided a full materials or method list for this one, in case this is an experiment you yourself might be exploring, but it is here as a general guide. So you see in my materials, I have specific numbers for everything that I need. For my water, I've said greater than 500 mils, as it might depend on how much water you're giving each plant, but it's just the general consensus there of what you need. The soil, it says brand of choice, because it might change based on what you can have access to. 15 pots and a room with consistent temperature, and a ruler, because it's good to have those measuring tools in there as well. You'll see in my method, I have distinct steps, giving clear and concise constructions. The way I always justify my method is that, say you're a grade 10 student, do you think you could give your method and materials to a grade 7, and if they could obviously understand the terms and science you're exploring, could they complete this experiment? If the answer is yes, then you've written a nice, clear method. If the answer is no, or maybe look at some of the steps you could edit and just clarify them a bit more clearly so that it's nice and easy to follow. Now, your results section might vary depending on what exactly you're experimenting with, but in general, it should include 3 distinct parts. A table of results that includes units, variables, trials, and average, and a clear title. A graph or visualization of your results. That's because not all experiments can have graphs, especially when there's lots of categorical variables at play. But your graph, if used, should only be based on your averages, has clear axes labeled and a title, and then a sentence or two giving a general summary of the general trends in your results. Looking at our example, you can see we have a clear table with a nice title that summarizes what we've got. It's got our water amounts and our units are included in our titles so that you don't have them throughout the entire table. And we've got our averages on the right for our 3 trials. Our graph beneath that only uses our averages and again has a clear title and axes are labeled, including the units. And finally, we have a short sentence here. You'd want to provide a bit more detail in your own lab report, but clearly we've stated this shows that more water makes the plant grow larger, as that is the summary of what the data is showing us in our results section here. The discussion should be the longest part of your lab report, as it is where you talk about your results and what you did in the experiment and what could be improved in the future. Much like your introduction, it should be 3 distinct paragraphs, starting quite narrow and focusing on your experiment, and then broadening out to the general science explored within your experiment. You'll see this is effectively the flip of the introduction, where we started broad and came down more narrow. So your first paragraph should really discuss your experiment in detail. How was it reliable? How it was accurate? How well did you control those control variables? You should also talk in this section about how you can improve your experiment and further testing that could be done. Your second section, or your second paragraph, should discuss how it is similar to other experiments and if you can accept or reject your hypothesis based on how well you think your data is fair and reliable, and whether it's similar results to other experiments of the same nature. Finally, you'd finish up your discussion by relating that to the broader structure of science and talking about what it means in terms of the science explored, and generalizing your results and referencing other topics within that same sort of field. For our example, our first paragraph, not going to go into them in too much detail here, but just talking about what we exactly would talk about. We might talk about how each repeat was similar and how we maintain the experiment conditions. Did we measure water and plant growth accurately? Well, did we have the right tools? And how can we improve that going forward? For our second section or paragraph, how do our results compare to other investigations? Are they similar or are they a bit different in what they show? What does this mean in terms of the science explored, generalizing our results with those other experiments? Could we accept our hypothesis, or should further experimentation be done in this field? Finally, we could finish off by discussing how could managing water usage in regards to plant growth be helpful to society, and what is already being done in this field, and those other experiments we discussed once again bleed into this one. As you'll see, it is a natural flow from those paragraphs, talking about your experiment and talking about what you could improve, flowing into other experiments, and then flowing back into that big picture of science that you have explored. Finally, we come to the conclusion. And much like its name, it should serve as a conclusion of what has been covered in your report. This should really be a final short summary of your experiment. It should be based on your discussion and use that information that you've worked throughout the lab report to conclude and give some conclusive statements on what your lab report has shown. You'd want to include whether your experiment is valid, meaning that it's fair, accurate, and reliable, and whether this means you can accept or reject your hypothesis. And you want to give a final statement regarding what your data showed, similar to what you put in your results, but more in a conclusive nature here after you've discussed whether the experiment is valid. For our example, I've written a short conclusion here. Further improvements could be made, however this experiment was quite accurate due to precise measurements, reliable with multiple trials with similar results, and most control variables were maintained. The data showed that more water led to more growth, showing a positive correlation between the amount of water and growth of a plant. While this data initially rejects the hypothesis, further testing would be helpful to give a conclusive answer. Although it may not be enough to accept or reject the hypothesis outright, it could be used as a base for further experimentation. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you now have a really good idea of how to write a really high standard lab report. Be sure to like, share and subscribe our videos and keep an eye out for further physics, chemistry and maths videos. Hope to see you back on the channel soon.